My name is Gene James. I'm a lifelong Topekan. I've lived here all my life, 84 years. And I'm going to tell you a story about one of Topeka's famous hamburger restaurants. Really, it's more about a push cart that was used by the guy that ran the restaurant. If you'd lived in Topeka in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, you would know the name Jimmy Knight. Jimmy was a Topeka restaurant owner who started his business in 1941. He was broke and started making chili and sandwiches in his home kitchen and selling them to the lunch counter in the State House. And for about a year that went on. And in 1942, he acquired a push cart and cut out the middleman and started selling his same foods himself from the push cart on the sidewalks of downtown, especially around the State House. In 1943, after a pretty good year in 42, he opened his first traditional restaurant, which was on Quincy Street, 700 block across from Topeka. Anyway, one morning in 1942, I went out looking for my grandfather. I knew he was around there somewhere, and I found him beside his garage workshop, looking at a strange contraption. I went down there, and it turned out to be a baby buggy. And he explained to me that a guy named Jimmy Knight had come to him and wanted that buggy frame converted into a push cart that he could sell food on the sidewalks of Topeka from. And so for the next week and a half, in his spare time, between other jobs, he built a box and put on that baby buggy frame. And he was pretty proud of it when it was done. He did a pretty good job, I guess. And I remember him showing it off to neighbors and to members of his family who always came to his house every Saturday night for a clan meeting, kind of. And then I never saw that cart, but I did tell the story about it whenever somebody talked about Jimmy Knight, and that was frequently because everybody knew Jimmy Knight. He was famous later for his hamburgers and his chili in his restaurants. And every once in a while the subject would come up about Jimmy, and I'd tell him about the push cart. Well, this was 75 years later, and I hadn't thought about that cart in a long time. And it was 3 years ago. I was on the internet, and I was at the State History Museum website called Kansas Memory. And they feature artifacts from the museum out there and usually give you a picture and a little story about something. I brought it up, and there's that cart. And I knew immediately it was that cart. I recognized it. And beyond that, it said Jimmy Knight on the side of the cart. He had a sign painted. It said Jimmy Knight chili and sandwiches, 10 cents. And I was amazed that the cart survived all that time. And I was glad that they had it out there. And I said, boy, I've got to go out and see that cart. Well, one thing led to another, and I didn't go for about a year. And then the next year I got sick, and I was sick for a year. And so last year I had kind of forgotten it, and I opened the Capital Journal one morning, and there's that same picture and essentially the same story. Capital had picked it up and run it and reminded me, and I said, I've got to go see that cart. So I went out pretty shortly after that, and I went in and told the receptionist what I wanted, and she said, well, you'll have to see the curator. Well, the curator, whose name was Blair Tarr, went back in the stacks, and he thought he knew about where that cart was, and he went back there to find it. I wandered around, and I could stay in there a month. I found a pair of horses, not one, but two stuffed horses, looked just alike, life size. There was a Civil War era cannon, a huge thing in there. There was a printing press that must have weighed 2 tons, old cast iron hand-operated printing press. Another machine that was even bigger, and I have no clue what it was. I couldn't even guess what it was. Like I say, I could spend a lot of time in there, particularly if I knew the background on all this stuff. You don't know what you're looking at in most cases. It's just there. But he found the cart, wheeled it out into an aisle where the light was better, and I looked it all over. I wanted to see what materials had been used and how it was put together and one thing and another. And he took notes, and he asked questions, and I answered him, and he said he would file those notes in his file on that cart. He already had a file. And I looked the cart over, and had a box on it so big, and it looked like one box, but it was really 2 compartments, one for sandwiches and one for chili. And the sandwich box was made of wood, and the chili compartment was made of metal so that it wouldn't catch on fire, because it had a stove. Originally it had a stove in it. It didn't have one yet now. And the wooden box was made out of the kind of boards that you would see in a porch ceiling, 3-inch board, tongue and groove board. I looked it all over. It was all put together with nails, and I knew it would be because Grandpa wouldn't use a screwdriver. And there were no electric screwdrivers in those days, and there were no Phillips head screws commonly used. They were all slot head. It took forever to put a screw in or take it out, and he nailed everything. And I finished looking it over, and I stood back and looked at it, and I could almost see him working on that cart. And it reminded me of the time I had spent with my grandfather. We were very close, and he was always teaching. I used to accompany him on his jobs, and he'd use me as a gopher. He'd say, go get me a hammer, go get me a 1/2-inch black iron elbow, and you better come back with the right thing, because this stuff he'd keep in his car. You better bring the right one back, or you get another lesson in how to identify things. But anyway, I was pretty moved by the whole experience, and I went over to that cart, and I laid my hands on top of the cart right where I figured he had to lay his hands when he was building it. I wanted to see if I could feel any connection there. And I could feel his energy. And for just a moment, I was back in 1942 outside his workshop where I'd spent so many hours as a boy, and then it faded away. But for just a bit, I was really moved. I couldn't even walk away from there. I was glad that the cart had been preserved, and I was glad to be able to set the record straight who built it, because up until then they assumed that Jimmy Knight built it himself. That's what his son had told him. Well, his son wasn't born when that cart was built, and he didn't really know. He, I think, just assumed that maybe Jimmy told him he built it. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. But I was glad to get it in the record, and I don't know whether the curator believed me or not. Don't really care. Got it off my mind. And it occurred to me that of all the things my grandfather made in his lifetime, which was many, he had built houses and garages and you name it, he had made it. That cart, that rude little cart, is probably the only thing that he ever made that survived. Everything else he ever made, I'm sure, is gone. Every house he lived in is gone. And I'm sure that would have surprised him if he knew that was going to be the case. That's my story.